Hi there. So this is actually a follow-up video to the one I made talking about trauma and the science of trauma. And I defined trauma as an emotional response to a terrible life event. So trauma could result from emotional negligence of the child, because children could also be traumatized. So it could happen right at childhood or right at that very tender developmental stage, or it could happen at adulthood or in adulthood. So it could be loss of a job, loss of a loved one to death. It could be as a result of separation, because when we form attachments, and there is a theory that explains the formation of attachment by John Bowlby. It's called the attachment theory by John Bowlby, 1948. So when an attachment is formed and there is two individuals, for instance, and they form an attachment, and I'm going to use a child and a mother to explain that theory, and that is how he explains it too. So when, for instance, a mother dies, the warmth and the protection and the feeding that the mother gave the child, even if the child is now grown and is an adult, the memories are already there and they cannot be erased, because human beings, their brains are not, they don't function like computers where you just go and push a button and delete. So when an attachment figure dies, the attachment to that individual lives on. So separation could also, trauma could also result from separation. Now, the symptoms that I mentioned were chiefly, I beg your pardon, chiefly for, I mentioned avoidance, I mentioned insomnia, I mentioned intrusive thoughts or violent flashbacks, and I mentioned, what's the other one? The fourth one, I can't quite recall. So, but for this video, I intend to clarify something. So, I mentioned in the previous video that the hippocampus is responsible for processing emotional memories. No, the hippocampus and the amygdala are both jointly brain regions responsible for processing memories, but the amygdala is responsible for processing and storing emotional memories, while the hippocampus is responsible for processing and storing factual and long-term memories. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the body's physiological response to a traumatic incident, a traumatic event. So there is the brain has a particular region that is referred to as the limbic system, and the hypothalamus is a part of that limbic system. It's responsible for detection of hunger. It's responsible for the lateral part of the hypothalamus is responsible for detection of hunger. It detects that sugar is low in the blood, so there is hunger. Now, the ventromedial part of the hypothalamus is responsible for detecting satiety. So it says you have taken enough water, you have taken enough food. Now, besides hunger, there is thirst, which is also an aspect that the hypothalamus is chiefly responsible for controlling. There is sexual behavior or reproductive behavior. There is sleep, and there is the regulation of bodily temperature. And the hypothalamus, now this is explaining the body's physiological response to trauma. The hypothalamus sends a signal to the master control gland, which is the pituitary gland. It is responsible for controlling the secretion of of hormones in the body, and so it secretes a hormone that helps for fight or flight response. And so in the experience of trauma, the body's digestion is slowed, and there is more energy to the muscular and skeletal system, which would help in the propagation of the fight or flight response. Now, fight or flight. Fight to confront the situation, or flight to run away or to flee. And to run away mustn't necessarily be to physically or practically run away. It could be to use some cognitive measures to dampen the effect of the situation so that the body would better respond to the situation. Now, I was going to talk about a certain secretion by the master control gland, the pituitary gland. So andrenaline is the name. So adrenaline is secreted and it charges the body, and the individual is then able to either fight or flight. Now, there is the sympathetic nervous system activation in the experience of trauma, and fear could also be experienced in trauma. So when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, it is supposed to help the body to deal with stress in that state of fear or in that state of attack. It could be a robbery attack on an individual, or it could be rape, and so on and so forth. So the individual whose skeletal system and muscular system is now charged and digestion slowed, with accompanied by that certain hormone or secretion of adrenaline, would then be able to cognitively and physically decide what is best to do in that certain scenario. So in the experience of fear in trauma, there may also be palpitation and increased heart rate and sweating. Now, all of these are to the effect that the individual is able to handle themselves during that traumatic experience. So after a while, the parasympathetic nervous system is activated. So the sympathetic nervous system is supposed to help an individual to deal with stress. And perhaps I could adopt this certain analogy, this particular analogy, in explaining the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system could be explained, or perhaps it could be, I could say it's like a car's accelerator. So it helps the body, propels the body, okay? And the parasympathetic nervous system slows the body down. It returns it back to normal functioning. So when adrenaline is secreted, when the muscular skeletal system is strengthened, it cannot stay that way for such a long time because of increased heart rate and palpitation. And so the heart is throbbing, and the number of times that the heart is beating per minute is also increased. So when the body stays in that state for too long, it's not good. This is why after the traumatic incident, when exactly it is happening, after it has happened, the parasympathetic nervous system sets in and slows the musculoskeletal system. It removes the working of that adrenaline, and then the person is calm. So I am going to say this again. An individual who has experienced trauma, it is very important for them to seek help from a professional, and for them to get trauma healing, because trauma could stay with an individual for a lifetime, and it's real. So go for trauma healing. You can see a psychiatrist, you can see a psychologist, you can see a therapist. A clinical psychologist is going to help quite a lot. So I hope that this information helps you if you have experienced trauma, or if you know someone who has. So go ahead, use it. Thank you for your time.